Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is second bite at the cherry in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 76, Queen's Gambit, Intermission Part 11. The steam from the natural hot spring laid thick over the air, creating a foggy layer over the mountainside. Konan was used to navigating damp weather, but there was still something about the fog that made her slow her movements and squint her eyes, just to make sure there was nothing she missed. It wasn't where she would have chosen to have a meeting, but admittedly this area was too remote for most to stumble upon accidentally, and it was the closest point where the three of them could come together without suspicion. At this point, she was supposed to be in Kirigakure. It was a long shot, but since that had been Kisame's home country, Nagato had reasoned that he and Itake might have run off there. Konan doubted it, but she had information that Nagato didn't. Information she was now unwilling to share. So long as Itake and Kisame stayed away, that only furthered her own plans. Nagato still trusted her enough to go and search on his behalf. Zetsu was covering Suna and Iwa, she was to cover Kiri. Haiden and Kakuza were to be going to Kumo to hunt Jinhiriki, and if they saw the rogue members on the way, all the better. Deidara and Sasori, otherwise occupied. Nagato himself had to remain in aim, and Madara? Who knew? He was the only wild card that worried Konan, so she was now coasting on an ironic prayer to whatever god would listen that Madara kept to himself and paid her little mind. She was Nagato's right hand. She had no reason to betray him. She was the first to reach the spring, and she allowed herself a brief moment of respite while waiting for the others to arrive. There were no hot springs in Aim. With the constant rain, it would have made open-aired springs a bit of a strange experience. Konan tentatively removed her sandals, not willing to completely lower her guard, but willing to at least warm her feet after a long journey. It was a while longer before another arrived, the tapping of his shoes apparent from some distance away. It was a small bit of relief to know he had arrived. She'd half expected one of Nagato's paths to show up instead, ready to drag her home and demand what she was doing halfway up in U. Her new companion let out a hefty sigh as he settled down next to the water. He removed his own sandals, joining her in dipping his own feet. He looked exhausted. His had probably been the longest journey, and he probably had the most on his plate out of all of them. So, are you going to tell me why you dragged me out into a hot spring in the middle of nowhere, Konan? My apologies for the inconvenience, Master Jiraiya. Unfortunately, this was the optimal location for the three of us to meet, without raising suspicion in those around us. The three of us. Jiraiya raised an eyebrow. The admission seemed only to make him seem more exhausted, and the man was already beginning to get on in years. Most shinobi didn't make it past their 20s. Konan could only imagine the weight Jiraiya held on his shoulders, making it as long as he had. When I asked if anyone in Akatsuki would be willing to join the coup, you weren't sure you could convince anyone. That wasn't a lie. This one, he came to me. He knew about our first meeting, every word of it. He claims to be on our side. That doesn't exactly inspire confidence. If he was able to listen in, then Nagato dash. This one's always been odd, just as much so as Nagato. Him finding out does not necessarily surprise me. It is his interest in the operation that confuses me. Seems like you don't trust him. I'm still not sure that I even trust you. Ah, come on, Konan. Not after all this time. I'm the one who trained you up, you know, even though you weren't even from my own village. I feel like I've earned a little trust, don't you? Konan didn't respond. The situation was difficult. Very, very difficult. She wanted to trust Jiraiya. She wanted to trust anyone. She missed Yahiko so badly that it hurt. She saw a pouting look on Jiraiya's face, but still kept silent. She instead closed her eyes, trying to enjoy the warmth of the water. It was enough, wasn't it? That she could close her eyes around him. That was more trust than she gave most. It had been something of a shock when she'd first met up with Jiraiya, realizing that he was the one who had snuck her a note. Konan had vaguely known that he was Konoha's spymaster, but it hadn't quite crossed her mind how capable he might be of infiltrating her own village. But there had also been a part of her that had felt relief. Jiraiya, perhaps more than anyone else alive, knew her and Nagato. If anyone was going to help her stop Nagato from losing himself completely, it would have to be their old teacher. It thankfully wasn't much longer before the third appeared. He was even louder than most, making Konan wonder if he really was taking this secret coup thing seriously. He was sprinting up the hill, huffing heavily as he lugged his impractical weapon up with him. "I'm late, I know, I'm fucking sorry. Ditching Kakuzu was harder than I thought. I practically had to drop a bounty in his fucking lap before the bastard let me have a damn minute to myself." Haydn let his scythe rest against a nearby rock before stripping off his cloak. From there, he went straight to the spring, not even hesitating to step in, still half-clothed, and submerged himself in the water. "Fuck, I missed hot springs. I cannot tell you how happy I was you let us meet here." Konan let her eyes glance over to Jiraiya, finding a small bit of amusement in her old mentor's disbelief. "He's the guy who found out." "Hey, it's not on me. Jashin is the one that led me to your little party. But I gotta admit, never thought in a million years that you'd be the one to turn on that pretender of a god, Angel." Konan frowned. "I didn't ask for the title. Bah, I don't have time to lecture you on Heat Henry. I'll wait until the pretender's gone and we don't have a Baijiryu apocalypse to worry about. This is that Jiraiya guy, right? Some sort of big shot Konoha dude to help us out." Some sort of big shot." Jiraiya sputtered. "I am the mighty Toad Sage, one of the legendary Sunin of Konoha." "Wait, aren't you the guy that writes those smutty romance books?" "I am also a highly renowned author, yes." Haydn just laughed at that, and maybe it was a little odd, but Haydn's at-ease posture in face of all that was going on was enough to let Konan ease up as well, if only a little. She hadn't really been able to relax in years, of course, but this was close. Far closer than she'd been able to get back in AIM. Maybe, when all this was done, if she lived through it, maybe she'd come back to you, just for a little while. "So let me get it straight, you're like Konan's old teacher or something, right? Then how the fuck did she end up in AIM? Why don't you start by telling us how you know about our collaboration to begin with?" Jiraiya countered. "We should all be honest with each other here, shouldn't we? Considering we're planning on taking on the Rinnegan. I told you, Jashin is the one who led me here. I had a vision of your first meeting, which was a sign clear as day that he wanted me to join in." "A vision? Look, hell if I know how a real god works, it just does." Haydn rolled his eyes and groaned. "As much as I'd love to try a conversion today, time's of the essence. Kakuzu won't suffer me off on my own for long. I did a tally of everyone, by the way, so consider that job done for you." Haydn pointed a finger at Konan. "Figured out everyone we've got a shot at bringing to our side of things. Plus, if we collaborate with Pinky, we can get all the bigwigs in a row, once she's figured out Kumo and Kiri, right? She might even have a fucking chance with creep-ass Orochimaru. Believe it or not, things are really fucking wild over there right now." Konan had to stifle a laugh as Jiraiya frantically looked back and forth between the two of them. If she was honest, she was probably just as confused as he was, though she'd been around Haydn enough to parse together some of the nicknames. "Sakura Harano," she clarified. "She's in Otagakure right now, attempting negotiations with your old teammate." "Succeeding negotiations," Haydn corrected. "She managed to get his interest by dangling information about the Sharingan in front of him. The hilarious bit is that she doesn't even really have any information, just a fluke she managed to figure out fighting that eyeball fucker back in Konoha. Well, damn it all, we were the ones who told her to catch his interest. Sharingan is one way." Jiraiya shook his head, but there was a proud smile on his face. "If she manages to get his signature on that treaty, I owe Tsunade a year's worth of drinks." "Haydn, you mentioned you'd done some reconnaissance." "More like some brain work, that's all." Haydn gestured as he talked. "Look, I already got Sakura working on one of them. You know as well as I do that Deidara doesn't give two shits about the organization. I don't think it'll take too much to convince him to try turning a bomb or two on Pain. Sasori, I mean, maybe Sakura will get lucky, but I'm not putting my money on that. Sakura's trying to smooth up to Orochimaru right now and Sasori's got one hell of a grudge against snakes. Even just one more in our favor is good. I'd accept Deidara." Konan answered with a nod. Any others? You might be able to spin Kakuzu if you put a big fat wad of cash in front of him. Honestly don't know if the bastard cares about anything else. Problem there is that he has a bit of a grudge with Taki for throwing him under the bus after he failed to assassinate the first Hokage, so maybe keep them out of his way if you go for him. I can bring it up with Tsunade. We might be able to petition the various Kage to start an Akatsuki demolition fund. Jiraiya mused. They've already been prepping their villages for attacks, but I'm not sure if that's going to be any help against the Rinnegan. Nagato couldn't attack multiple villages in quick succession. If he goes for one, that will take almost everything he has. Konan added. It might mean sacrificing one village, but doing so would ensure the others would be able to take him, unless something changes radically in the immediate future regarding his strength. Always that Madara guy to worry about. I'd be more worried if I was convinced it was actually Madara. Jiraiya countered. Sakura had a theory on the guy a while back. He's definitely an Uchiha, but unless there's something we don't know, there's no way he's Madara. Of course, the one person we could ask has gone dark. Yeah, I don't know what to tell you about Itaki and Kisame. They're traveling for sure, but Jashin won't show me where the fuck they are. Haiden raised a hand to his temples, massaging them gently. Hurts to even try. Guess Jashin doesn't think they're important enough to show me much about. I don't even got a clue why they suddenly decided to fuck off. I do. Jiraiya admitted. There's no other answer that makes sense. He heard about what happened at Konoha and learned the truth about why he was forced to kill his clan. He was my original link into Akatsuki, but he's gone dark even from me. I cannot say that I blame him. Hearing from that man what he did, Konan closed her eyes again. Her rage still hadn't died down, even with the man dead. It was bad enough that he ruined a peaceful future for a Megakure. I cannot even fathom why he would destroy one of the strongest clans in his own village for his personal benefit. So attack is out, is what you're saying? And looks like he convinced Kisame to go along with him. Fuck me, that's a bad situation. Who knows where they'll end up? And Zetsu? Look, I know it's bonkers, but I can't get anything on Zetsu. Nothing at all. I've asked Jashin, and all I get are these weird-ass visions that don't make any sense. Something like a weird aura in a cave sometimes, maybe even tree bark, I don't know, the guy's not right, not even God wants to look at him. So you're saying that we've got two potentials in Deidara and Kakuzu, and the rest are wild cards? Yeah, that's about right. Haiden threw his arms wide. Sorry, but I'm the best you've got, Angel. Konan rolled her eyes. She'd never really spent that much time talking directly to Haiden before, and she was starting to think she understood why Kakuzu threatened to kill him so much. Ally, she reminded herself. They were all allies. We need to start by putting together contingency plans. Jiraiya spoke up, pulling out a notebook as he did so. I'm counting on you in particular, Konan, to help me come up with plans for each village to deal with potential attacks by Nagato. You're the most familiar with his abilities and what he can do. The more we can start planning now, the more lives we might be able to save if he decides to make taking the Jinchuriki personal. Of course. Konan nodded. I'll tell you what I can. Good, that means I can zone out for a bit. Haiden leaned back into the water, shutting his eyes. Ignore me for a bit, alright, I'm gonna check in on Sakura. Deidara and Sasori are probably at Oto by now and I want to make sure she's kicking some ass. Konan didn't answer. She watched as Haiden removed his necklace and linked the chains around his fingers. It was quiet, and it took a minute for her to register that Haiden might actually be meditating. Is everyone in Akatsuki insane? It's possible it might have been a secret recruitment requirement. Konan began to talk. It was gut-churning, revealing some of Nagato's best-kept secrets, but she stilled her heart by reminding herself that it was Jiraiya she was talking to. Jiraiya already knew that Nagato had the Rinnegan. Jiraiya probably could have discovered some of these things on his own with enough time. She wasn't damning Nagato. No, if anything, she was saving him. This wasn't the path they had been meant to follow. If she let him continue, he'd be damning himself and the world he thought he was saving. She finished, and for a time both she and Jiraiya fell into silence, letting the soft bubble of the hot spring wash over them. She wasn't sure if she'd removed a weight from her shoulders or added more to it, by speaking so much of Nagato. She'd chosen her path now. There was nothing she could do but follow it. The silence was interrupted only by a sudden outburst from Haydn, who flew into a fighting stance and shouted out suddenly. "No, no, kick his ass, what are you doing?" Haydn blinked his eyes open, looking around before swearing even more than usual. "Son of a, got fucking disconnected, of course. Yo, smutty sage, wanna tell me why all you Konoha guys are so damn unwilling to stab a bitch? Sasori's just fucking asking for it too, the smug jerk. Are you going to share with the class what you're talking about?" Sakura and Sasori are in it now, and she somehow roped Orochimaru into helping her out. But it looks like the snakes, I mean, I don't want to say he's dying, but Sakura seems half convinced if Sasori gets a hit in, he might go down. And that Ichibu's got his hands full with some Kaze cage puppet, I don't even know what the fuck dash, don't give me that look, you asked what I saw, I'm telling you. Are you sure you can't explain how you're managing to telescope into a fight an entire country over? Wanna convert to Jashinism? Right now I'm thinking I need to get to Oto before Sakura dies. Shit, you're that worried? Don't be. Little pinky ass kicker's got a trick or two up her sleeve yet. And I need to get back to Kakuzu before he starts thinking too hard about where I am. Haydn trudged his way out of the spring, throwing his cloak over his shoulder and grabbing his scythe. Keep me in the loop, huh? And I'll let Sakura know what's going on next time she connects. At this point I'm desperate to get into a real fight, you know? It's not fair that she gets a fight and I'm sitting here playing diplomat. Everything's fucking backwards. Maybe I should go see if Kakuzu needs help with that bounty. The hot springs fell quiet once again as Haydn left. Konan and Jiraiya's eyes met, each of them wondering something similar. What the fuck had they gotten involved in? What is this place? That where Madara does not wish us to go. It was cold here, and not the familiar damp cold of the mist that Kisame often grew nostalgic for. It was a bitter, dry cold that threatened to freeze his gills. It hadn't snowed, not yet, but it was perhaps inevitable with the oncoming winter. Kisame would have never moved so far north without Itachi to urge him onward. He was curious, he would admit, as to why Madara Jr. and the Zetsu so fervently attempted to drive people away from the far north of the mountain's graveyard. As far as he had ever known, there was nothing but ancient bones and old trees out here, coupled with the abundance of feral white Zetsu to drive away anyone who thought of settling the area. But why, Itachi had asked, do the white Zetsu come from here? Why had Madara Jr. layered the borders with disorienting genjutsu to prevent explorers from getting too far within? What was buried within that was so important to keep safe? Their journey had taken them to some very interesting locations. A deep cavern and an unmarked grave. A series of journals unreadable to anyone without Sharingan eyes. A phrase that drove even the dying Itachi onward, desperate for truth, for answers that had been kept from him, from the world. He hadn't expected dragging out Akatsuki's dirt to be so interesting. He wasn't surprised that there were buried truths, of course. That was predictable. But he'd never imagined that they'd be led into the middle of nowhere seeking out something so strange and esoteric. The God Tree. Kisame didn't believe in gods. If gods were real, they were just as despicable as humans, which meant they couldn't be godly. Only a truly sadistic force would have godlike power and not use it to calm the suffering of humanity and guide them towards peaceful paths. Humanity suffered, so gods could not be real. But the author of the Sharingan journals had no other name for the mysterious tree in the north that they claimed spawned the power of Kaguya, and Kisame was willing to entertain that there was at least something interesting to investigate. They had stopped in front of a cavern with a sprawling mouth, the interior so dark that Kisame could not see more than a few meters into it. Itachi had come to a dead halt, and a shiver from Samehada was more than enough to tell him why. The air was thick with chakra, so thick that it had to be a barrier. No ordinary barrier. Itachi confirmed. The chakra network fueling it, I've never seen anything like it. Madara could never have generated such a thing. It would have taken the chakra of 1,000 shinobi to make it. And breaking it. 1,000 more. That, or a handful of really dedicated Jinhuriki? The two men looked at each other then, realization dawning on both of their faces simultaneously. Ah! A relatively simple answer to that question. So, surprise, Payne's been lying about his true intentions. No, I don't think so. Itaka shook his head. Misleading, perhaps. I think Payne believes whatever lies beyond this barrier will help him shape the world into what he desires. Madara, on the other hand, no doubt also wanted whatever this barrier held, but likely for completely different reasons. That's one answer, but far more questions have arisen from it. We have yet to find the God Tree, but we can assume that is what lies beyond this barrier. We have yet to learn what it is that drives Payne and Madara to seek it. Whatever it is, it's worth more than 9 Baijuyu. Itaka was troubled. He didn't resort to grunts unless he couldn't give words to his own thoughts, and at this particular moment, Kisame couldn't blame him. He drew Samehada with a flourish, pointing it at the barrier and slowly moving forward until the tip touched the exterior. Samehada fed upon chakra, so maybe it might. He heard a whimper from Samehada's mouth, and saw a spark of energy upon contact. Worth a shot, I suppose. Kisame holstered the sword again, this time reaching out with his own hands to confirm the barrier's strength. It wasn't gentle, he was pretty certain he'd fought a few Kumo shinobi whose lightning felt gentler than the shock he weathered. Also worth a shot, though he might not have feeling in his hand for the next few minutes. So he needs the 9 Jinhuriki to take it down. You know, the ironic thing is, that Harano girl is probably closer to getting through this barrier than he is. Ironic, perhaps. But I believe it is also fate. A barrier brought down not by force, but by cooperation. The Baijuyu have roamed this world for generations, never working as one. Forces of destruction, wrapped by the first Hokage and the Uzumaki princess into human form and gifted to the shinobi nations. But those who truly harness the Baijuyu's power, coming together as one nation, only they can find what lies within. Perhaps the barrier's true intent. It's a little optimistic. Kisame countered. Madara certainly seems more than eager to brute force it. And do we let him? Itaka met his eyes, and Kisame couldn't help but grin. I'm getting the impression that you're suggesting a hard no, Itaka. It's a question for you, Kisame. There's no possible way I'll make it to the end of this. As if to emphasize, Itaka coughed. The disease was deep in his lungs now, there was no denying that, and Itaka still had little desire to seek aid, even if it was within his grasp. You told me you'd try to find someone worth following, Kisame. Madara is not that man. Payne is not that man. Maybe that man was supposed to be you. Then you must carry this on when I am unable to. You must do this for me. And right now, there exists one person who is working in direct opposition to Madara's goals. Someone who might be capable of uniting the Jinhuriki. Someone who might even be capable of helping my brother find peace. Kisame knew what Itaka was asking. He didn't like it, but who was he to deny a dying man's wish? And maybe, just maybe, a little part of him really wanted to see what lay beyond that barrier. The stench of foul chakra was in the air, something that made the beast within her writhe with discontent. Something that didn't belong in Kumogakure. The power of the Matatabi had gifted her with the true senses of a hunter. From the young age at which she'd had the Baijuyu stored inside her, she'd always found it easier to smell the world around her, and she learned to distinguish each individual member of her village by scent. It was easier than one might think. Living in a village tended to dispose one to certain flavors, and it was all too easy to know the difference between someone who'd been born in Kumo and someone who had immigrated there, simply by the severity of certain scents. Chakra, too, had a scent, though that had taken far longer to learn. Once she'd picked it up, however, she'd become an impeccable hunter. Few genjutsu affected smell, which meant that she could easily sniff out those in disguise or those attempting to hide from her. Yujito was a hunter, through and through. Even if the village shunned her, they needed her skills, even now after Kumo had withdrawn into its borders and shifted their innovation from ninjutsu to technology. Some called her NB remnants of a darker age. Yujito knew the truth. The world would never stop needing Jinhuriki, and the foul chakra only proved it. Could technology have told the Raikage that someone had infiltrated their village? Someone who smelled of death and rot? And yet, the owner of this stench was wise, and perhaps knew of her abilities. They had begun to cover their smell with other things, heavy spices perhaps, maybe cleaning equipment. Enough to prevent Yujito from sniffing them out directly, but not enough to prevent her from knowing they were there. It was only a matter of time. No one could say that the Matatabi couldn't sniff out a rat. Hey yo, Yujito. There's some news, don't ya know? Her concentration was broken by B's deep voice, and Yujito couldn't help but hiss in discontent. Damn it, B, I was onto something. Still sniffing a rat? How's that? They're good. Once I've dragged them out, I'll be sure to learn how they've covered their scent so well. I can only faintly pick up their chakra, and they've been leaving traces of it everywhere to throw me off. Shit, man, never heard of anyone throwing off your nose. Then again, you never know, that's just how living goes. You said you had news. B thrust a newspaper in front of her. The layout was unfamiliar, and Yujito read for a moment before realizing that this was a newspaper from Konoha. Economic boom, newfound peace treaty leads to unprecedented trade between the lands of earth, fire, and wind. Peace treaty. Yujito sniffed with discontent. This wasn't good. If Iwa, Konoha, and Suna were aligning, the three countries could easily overpower their own with a concentrated effort. What had spurred this sudden change? Iwa had always been hostile to Konoha. There's this girl going around speaking peace, you see? They even think she might be head into our country. Bullshit she is. Yujito growled. Nobody's tried that sort of thing since Hashirama Senju. Times are a-changin'. The old ways are aging. And what does A think? B just smiled and shrugged, which told Yujito all she needed to know. Kumo had already taken their stance in the world. No girl was going to change that. It didn't matter to her, anyway. Jinhuriki didn't interfere with politics. Jinhuriki were tools, weapons. Hunters. And she had a rat to sniff out. Chapter 77. Suna had many sayings, but one in particular had always hung within Gaara's mind. Not even the third could conquer the desert. It was somewhat tongue-in-cheek, a commentary on the mysterious disappearance of their once feared and beloved leader. None had ever known what had happened to the third, and thus the citizens concluded that he had fallen in the desert, buried beneath the sands and never to be found by a living soul. Shinobi were dangerous, but the summer desert under the full heat of the sun? More lethal than anything. Gaara had been gifted the title of desert when he was young, for none in the village had been as lethal as he. He'd felt a twisted sense of pride in it back then, back when he had been determined to bring about the extinction of the human race and labeled himself monster. He had been more than human, more than shinobi, desert incarnate, with each grain of his sand dragging down his foes and burying them beyond salvation. He'd wondered, at times, if he had become stronger than the third. Would the iron sand hold up against his own? Would he have devoured the third as the desert had, its true incarnation? As his sand clashed against the puppet's iron, he still continued to wonder. The iron was relentless, and Gaara couldn't help but marvel at Sasori's ability to engage the others while still keeping him at bay. He was of the desert, but Sasori was the red sand, named so for the rivers of blood spilt to keep Sunagakuer safe. But Sasori was no third, and though he wielded puppets with ease, he could not fall into the same mastery of the sand as one who had been wielding it since he was born. It didn't matter that the iron grains were slick with poison, shaped into countless blades that bombarded the arena with gusto. It was slow, slower than his own, and with each distraction that the Tanuki and Sakura dumped upon Sasori, the slower the third became. Perhaps others couldn't see it, but Gaara had been training to see ever since the Tanuki had thrust him into Shikoku. The nuances in the movement, the shift in attention, Sasori was occupied, and he'd never have a better chance of laying the third to rest within the sand once again. And Gaara hadn't been wasting time in this fight. He'd been busy. Making golden sand was an exhaustive technique, and if not for Shukaku's chakra fueling him, he might have passed out from the effort long ago. He couldn't afford to waste his personal sand, no, that had to be dedicated to the fight. So Gaara instead had to slowly pull grains from the earth beneath the floor, weaving it through cracks in the tiling and soaking his chakra within it, changing the composition until it shimmered. His father had mastered this technique, once upon a time. A part of Gaara found it ironic that he was learning to master it now. He'd wanted to distance himself from his father, distance himself from the man who had tried to shape him into a tool, who hadn't seen him as a son but a weapon to be forged. "I'll wield it better than you ever did," Gaara had decided. "And by the time I'm grown, no one will even remember that it was you who used it first." Sakura had bought him the time he needed, and now Sasori seemed to be distracted with, wait, were they just talking? Granted, Sasori had Sakura at blade point, so it wasn't exactly a de-escalated situation, but of course Sakura would find a way to chat with her opponent mid-spar. He wondered, briefly, if it was a Konoha thing. Even with all the time he'd spent with Sakura, he never found himself wanting to chat with an opponent. A fight was a fight. And yet, if not for Naruto. Still, now he had to sit there and wonder if Sakura wasn't going to find some way for Sasori to work for them too. No. Shikaka rumbled within him. That man is too far gone. How could a man who turned hundreds into his puppets ever empathize with humanity? True, perhaps. But Gaara had likely killed hundreds in his lifetime, and was still, even after all this time, willing to kill to keep his loved ones safe. At what point did killing become unforgivable? At what point was someone savable or beyond saving? Now that was his problem, Gaara realized. It wasn't that he was a chatterbox while he fought, it's that he thought too damn much. Sasori was distracted, and he had an opportunity. He raised his golden sand up from the ground around him and honed it in on the third. As before, even with Sasori's attention elsewhere, the iron sand rose up to challenge him. The sand, of course, was being lifted with the magnet release technique, a combination of elemental chakras that led to such a specific manipulation of the earth. Gold, as it was taught to him by the Tanuki, could purify the elemental chakra in a technique and render it elementless. This did not apply to yin and yang chakra, which technically limited its effectiveness and did not prevent Sasori's puppetry. Chakra threads were already pure chakra, simply laced with the user's intent. But all the iron sand that the puppet was being forced to manipulate wouldn't work without magnet release. Sand hit sand and gold enveloped iron, until bit by bit it all fell to the floor below, useless. Gaara couldn't help but smile as he saw Sasori falter in the conversation, looking towards the third as it uselessly tried to manipulate the sand once more. Now, he was the distraction. Sakura took the opportunity to dash forward, slamming her fist into the puppet's chest. There was a small pause and a hint of resistance, but eventually Sakura's force overpowered it, and something popped out of Sasori's back. A gray cylindrical object, with some sort of seal upon it, clattered to the ground, and after a moment so did Sasori's puppet body. No, not just Sasori's body, but every puppet he'd been controlling. Perfect timing, Gaara. Sakura called out, giving him a thumbs up. That has to be where he stored his life force. If it's not in the puppet, he can't control it. A rather unfortunate weakness, Orochimaru commented. His breathing was uneven, Gaara noticed at a glance, and the once composed shinobi looked exhausted. Yes, the fight had been going on a while, but enough to exhaust a Sunin? He's losing his grip on that body. So soon and so suddenly? How long had it been since Sasuke had left the village? Over a year, not nearly close enough to 3. It's possible that 3 had been an overestimate, or maybe Orochimaru's jutsu was having a compounding toll every time he possessed someone new. If that was the case, how did he hope to maintain Sasuke's body? They had time to find out, he supposed. With Sasori disabled, all that was left was seeing if they could rope Deidara away from Akatsuki and they were in the clear. Simple and quick. Technically no casualties, assuming Karin had evacuated the village in time. Sasori's life force was technically still alive, and maybe they could take advantage of that. Get Suna to make a non-lethal puppet that could allow him to talk. Yo, brat. That's a little fucked up. Are you suggesting we make Sasori a talking piece of furniture? Gaara couldn't help but chuckle aloud. No, he was definitely not suggesting that. For now, he was suggesting putting Sasori into a locked box and making sure he couldn't hurt anyone else until they figured out what to do with him. He was tired himself, even with Shikako supplementing him. Sure, he wanted to talk big by claiming he would use his father's technique better than he ever did, but making gold sucked, and he was pretty sure his father had made gold sand in advance so that he didn't have to in battle. Something he could start doing, if he was bored on the road. One by one, his tanuki gave their regards and began to reverse summon home. Meanwhile, Sakura bent down to pick up Sasori's life container, turning it over in her hands. Thinks I can figure the seal out? Probably. He attacked my village, so I'll figure the seal out. Orochimaru demanded. Suna has the rights to this bastard, I can't just hand him over. I landed the finishing blow, so he's my takedown, and that means I take him to Suna. Brat. If Sasori had to transfer his life force into that thing, do you really think he wouldn't have a contingency plan for if someone knocked it out? How did he get it into the puppet into the first place? Gaara thought on this as Orochimaru stalked forward to bicker with Sakura, momentarily distracted by the fact that the two actually were just bickering like they'd known each other forever. Sasori could have started with the container already in the puppet, but how did the container control the puppet to begin with? Chakra strings, it had to be, generated from the container, and that meant Sakura dash. She looked his way as he called out, and as she did the container suddenly flew from her hands. It slotted itself into Sasori's body. Chakra strings. It could move a puppet so obviously it could also move itself. Gaara's sand exploded forward, instinctively moving around Sakura as the puppet began to move. In the blink of an eye, Sasori struck. But not for Sakura. Blades lashed out and cut into Orochimaru's skin. The snake had dodged, but not nearly quick enough to prevent his shoulder from getting slashed by Sasori's weapon. The two jumped backwards towards Gaara's protection, but the damage had already been done. Sakura looked towards him with a grim expression. Sasori was a master of poisons. All of his weapons were likely coated with poison. Soon you will be down one man. Sasori spoke, raising his puppets around him once more. And since you were kind enough to dismiss your summons for me, this battle is once again in my favor. You were soft. Should have stabbed the damn thing while we had the chance. Gaara couldn't use any of his gold without giving the third its iron sand back, which meant he was down to his usual repertoire of sand. He could protect the two of them here, but only if they stayed within his dome. And Orochimaru. Would it be too much to ask for someone to go down simply for once? Sakura lamented. She had already pulled out a scroll with a sealed-away first aid kit, moving to Orochimaru's side while Gaara thickened the sand wall around them. It was dark, but Sakura always kept flashlights now for just this occasion. Don't bother. Orochimaru insisted. Unless you know medical jutsu, none of the standard antidotes will be effective. I have a tourniquet. Sakura offered. I could chop your arm off. If only you could have done so at the moment of the attack, but I'm afraid Sasori's poisons work far quicker than that. Orochimaru shook his head, and Gaara could see beads of sweat forming on his skin. To survive I will need either the creation of an antidote, or to attempt to switch bodies ahead of schedule. Either way, you will be facing Sasori alone. Two options? No, those weren't the only options. Orochimaru didn't know about the third. Gaara looked up to meet Sakura's eyes, seeing that she too was thinking of a third option. Jashin's power. But Sakura was hesitating, and at first Gaara couldn't see why. It was simple. Heal Orochimaru, get back into the fight. But if she didn't heal him? If she didn't heal him, he'd be forced to try and take Sasuke over early. As far as Tsunade and Jiraiya had believed, the odds of this succeeding would be far lower, perhaps impossible. It was a jutsu only meant to succeed once every 3 years. Though of course, it was possible that Orochimaru had purposely spread misinformation, but if so, then why hadn't he taken Sasuke sooner? If it had been a year from now, there wouldn't have been a debate. There was no risking Sasuke, and having Orochimaru on their side against Sasori was more useful than not. But now? With poison weakening him and a low chance of him being able to take Sasuke at all? Gaara could see why Sakura was hesitating. It was possible this was their chance to bring Orochimaru down for good. Hell, if you let the poison weaken him enough to kill him now, you can always pin his death on Sasori. Shikako spoke the truth. It meant they'd have to take Sasori down on their own, but they could always bunker down and wait for backup. He had faith in Sai and Sasuke and Karin, faith in their ability to either disable Deidara or change his allegiance. And Jugo was likely still attempting to find where Kabuto had squirreled them away to. He could be there at any minute and then the tables would start to turn in their favor again. He could summon more Tanuki if Jugo was around to keep Sasori off their back. They could win without Orochimaru. In fact, they'd always planned on it. It was objectively the better decision to let this poison do its job. Karin would become Otokage, and Oto would join the treaty. Sasuke would be safe, and a powerful foe would be taken care of. And yet what would it mean? They would live with a lie, live with a scenario they could have fixed for their own benefit. Much like Danzo had justified the genocide of an entire clan for the benefit of the Leaf, for his own benefit, they too will have brought death for their own gain. At what point would they draw the line? At what point, he found himself asking again, did killing become unforgivable? Sakura's eyes tore away from his own, and he knew that she was asking herself the exact same question. Sai was starting to see spots whenever he closed his eyes. Deidara wasn't just a bomber, no, he was the bomber. He had come into this fight with so much exploding clay that he could probably terraform the entirety of Otogakure into his image if not for the fact that Sasuke was so diligently keep them disabled or too high in the air to damage anyone. Karin, too, was dexterously using her chakra chains to grab whatever bombs Sasuke missed and fling them back towards Deidara with frightening precision. Ideally, she would be using her chains to restrain the man, but Deidara was proving a bit too nimble on that clay bird of his, and exceedingly determined to keep the fight out of her grasp if he could help it. He'd expected Deidara to double down on trying to keep this fight between artists, but the man was fully focused on Sasuke now, and Sai could put together that he was simply trying to eliminate the third wheel so they could get back to their fun. But the Uchiha was far too skilled to fall to a mere bomb, even he had to acknowledge that. Every slash of his lightning-coated blade was made with the accuracy of only someone who had mastered the Sharingan, and there wasn't a single movement wasted as Sasuke leapt from building to building, gliding with the help of the grotesque wings that had been gifted to him by the curse mark. He could almost see the beauty in how Sasuke fought, and he was certain the Hagashis Eye would, but it was overshadowed by the curse's transformation. If Sai wanted to look at wings, he'd look at animals that were meant to have them. He arched his own bird across the sky, halting in his barrage of ink animals to consider the situation. They could drag this out, sure, but Sakura and Gaara were down there sparring with Sasori, and more than anything Sai wanted to ensure that they were well. He and Deidara could talk art later, after Sasuke's interrogation. They hadn't been fighting without purpose, after all. Karin had been planning ahead for a while, and she had learned the esoteric Uzumaki sealing arts from scrolls rescued from Orochimaru's eager clutches. Of course, seals had to be placed on flat surfaces, which was a downside when fighting an enemy who preferred to be in the air. But an air enemy could be manipulated, and that's what Sai and Sasuke were for. Two people could push the direction a fight went in, and Karin, well, she was likely perpetuating that she was stuck on the ground, unable to do much besides reach out with chakra chains, but in actuality staying on the ground was the strategy. She needed to be ready to activate her seal the moment Deidara was in range. A barrier seal, a specialty that she'd honed under Orochimaru's guidance, one that could keep the power of Deidara's bombs contained to a predetermined, safe spot while also containing Deidara himself. He wouldn't blow himself up for no reason, not when there was no chance of escaping. All they had to do was lure Deidara in and then force him to the ground. And as luck would have it, they were almost there. A training ground just on the outskirts of the village, one that Sasuke had used countless times before. Sai scanned the area with his scope, catching glimpses of the various paper seals that Karin had used to decorate the perimeter. The time had come, and he knew the strategy. He started by urging his own ink bird upwards above Deidara, preparing a series of attacks as he did so. Instead of aiming for Deidara specifically, he set loose a large flock of ink birds that blanketed the sky. He watched Deidara's eyes widen, clearly not expecting the sudden surge, and smiled as the bomber did exactly as he expected. He flew downwards, attempting to buy time as he created a clay counter. Sasuke stepped up, attacking from the side so that Deidara specifically lowered in the direction of the training ground. Instead of lightning, Sasuke's hands weaved and an enormous ball of fire spewed forth from his mouth. An Uchiha specialty, if Sai remembered correctly. Deidara dipped lower and lower, arching closer and closer to the target, and then a barrier of chakra, concentrated and pure red, erupted from the ground around Deidara. It formed a dome about 50 feet high, and as it formed, Sai watched as Karin's chakra chains weaved across to form an extra layer. Gotcha! Karin called out. Try flying out of this one, huh? Nobody escapes the adamantine chains of the Uzumaki clan. Son of a bitch. He heard Deidara curse. He saw several claybirds fly and detonate against the barrier walls, but to no avail. You fucking planned on trapping me this whole time. Bingo. Fell right for it, didn't ya? Karin was answered with more explosions, and Sai was less sure about his earlier postulation that Deidara wouldn't blow himself up for no reason. He took in a deep breath, letting his ink bird land on the ground and disperse. Maintaining it took concentration and a steady trickle of chakra, something that he didn't want to waste when he had another fight to go interfere with. But first, Deidara. He spoke up, heading to the barrier's perimeter. He waited for the explosions to cease, knowing that he, out of everyone there, would be best at getting Deidara's attention. We set up this barrier here because of what I said before. We don't have to be enemies. So what, you're going to lock me into here until I swear loyalty or something? No. We're going to lock you in there until you tell Sasuke about his brother, and then we're going to attempt to have a civil discussion about the benefits of joining the Shinobi Neutrality Project. Do I look fucking neutral to you? What do you think my art is, dumbass? It's blowing shit up. Controlled demolitions are necessary for terraforming areas for human civilization, as well as opening up mining areas for the collection of ores that are used in Dash. I came from fucking IWA, I know what controlled demolitions are. Ah, right. Then it'll take less time to explain things. Sai put on his best smile. It still looked a little fake, no. Who was he kidding? It looked awkward as hell and Gaara was absolutely going to give him shit for it. Besides, do you really think Akatsuki are utilizing your artistic skills to their fullest extent? Do you think your leader even knows what art is at all? Deidara frowned, walking forward until he could lean against the barrier, as close as he could get to Sai. You're a bastard, you know that. People usually say that to me when I'm right. Move it. He felt himself getting shoved aside as Sasuke approached the barrier, his curse mark receding back to its spot on his shoulder. Of course, Sasuke was single-minded as always, and he finally had a lead regarding his brother and how to find him. And as he'd recognized before, he had to help Sakura out before he could waste time with Deidara. I'll be back with Sakura. Sai promised, mostly towards Karin, who gave him a thumbs up. Don't bully him too much. You're gonna leave me here with the Uchiha. Deidara called out, banging his fist against the barrier. Hey, come on, huh? I thought you liked me. Artists gotta stick together, you can't just abandon me after all that. If you tell him what he wants to know, he'll leave you alone. Sai gave Deidara a small wave. Even if he could stick around, Sasuke assuredly wouldn't let them talk until he'd squeezed everything out of Deidara anyway. Sakura it was, despite Deidara's yells of protest as he turned to head towards the nearest entrance to the underground. It was quiet, mostly because the shinobi had evacuated to specific bunkers and wouldn't leave until Karin gave them the all-clear. But as he headed closer and closer to where Sakura was due to be fighting with Sasori, he realized it was too quiet. Shouldn't he be hearing the sound of battle by now? His question was answered as he turned a corner and bumped into none other than Jugo. At first, Sai was relieved. If Jugo was here, the battle was done, right? And then Jugo explained that Sakura hadn't made it to the rendezvous point, and Sai's entire body went cold. If not here, then where? Notes. Chapter 78. The first step to understanding a person, the Jushisai had told her, was to understand what made them happy. Sakura's inner thoughts were tongue-in-cheek as she considered Orochimaru. The bastard's probably at his happiest when he's drowning puppies. The Jushisai claimed that there was value in all life, in every experience, and that it was through experiencing the points of view of all life that one could truly understand life. Oniki had impressed upon her that an ambassador must be willing to throw aside bias for the sake of cooperation, and that she would naturally come across people she disliked and would have to work with them despite her own inner thoughts believed, without a shadow of a doubt, that Orochimaru would be better off dead. That there wasn't a single bit of benefit to trying to understand him. That there wouldn't be any way of convincing him to join a peaceful treatise. The man had invaded Konoha on a whim. The man tortured living beings in his attempt to further science. He was a sadist. A narcissist that thought only of himself and of his own power. He's only here now because you have something he wants. He's only here now because killing Sasori would be pleasurable to him. It's not like he was always a prick. Tsunade said thoughtfully, mulling over a piece of barbecue. Well, okay, maybe he was, but in the way that Sai of yours is a prick. He was blunt. He thought he was doing us a favor by pointing out the obvious. If anything, he was a biggest proponent of the greater good over the well-being of an individual. If someone was weak, what good were they for the village? But he must have thought well of you and Jiraiya, his teammates. Maybe. Tsunade admitted. He didn't like Jiraiya at all, at first. I think if he'd been given the chance, he would have taken me and left Jiraiya in the dirt. He didn't think it was worth the effort of teaching him. And now that Jiraiya's become stronger, I think he doesn't like Jiraiya now because he proved him wrong. The Jushisai said the second step to understanding someone was to understand what caused them pain. Pain was born of fear, born of suffering and tribulation. Pain showed what a person's heart truly latched onto. If you did not care for someone, you felt no pain when they suffered, if they died. Feeling pain meant that there was some bond that you clung to, be it to yourself and your own well-being, or the well-being of another. To truly know someone, you must know what they loved and what they feared. What they were willing or unwilling to endure. Orochimaru is willing to endure pain and death for my knowledge. For Sasori's destruction. For chaos, for war and violence upon the hidden leaf. For the sake of power, Sasuke's power, Kagaya's power. What did Orochimaru want? What was he willing to endure anything for? Was there anything he wouldn't do to reach that goal? If Sakura kept him alive here and now, would his drive and endurance serve to undo everything she hoped to accomplish? It should have been easy. Let him die. Let him die and wait for Jugo and Sai to arrive, let Sasori be overwhelmed with numbers and let Orochimaru simply be a battle casualty. They could mourn the loss of a brilliant mind and move Otagaku forward into an era of peace. Karin would be with her. Karin would work with her. Orochimaru's breathing hitched and he lurched forward, stopped only by Sakura reaching out to steady him. The poison was moving. From what information Cho had sent them, the poison likely wouldn't be immediately lethal. Sasori liked to play with his prey. Liked to drag information out of them with the promise of an antidote, letting them die only when they chose to defy him, or as his whim suited him. But that didn't mean the poison wouldn't make a person suffer. Get a move on, Harano. Orochimaru hissed. This sand dome won't keep him out forever. Move on with the battle, Orochimaru was insisting. Leave him to handle his own fate. Even he wanted her to let him go. Not that Sakura thought the man would go down without a fight, he'd simply try to find Sasuke before the poison overtook him. But they could kill him here and now before he had a chance, weakened by poison, all her problems solved. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. He's going to have to die. Sakura's breathing steadied as she rested. Dodging Tsunade's furious strikes was difficult enough when she wasn't being interrogated, and she'd take every break the woman allowed her. Even with her steadiness returning, she couldn't find it in her heart to disagree with the Hokage. You don't think there's even remotely a chance of him agreeing? Oh, he might agree. And he'll bide his time, get whatever he wants out of the arrangement, and then go his own way when it benefits him most. That's just the kind of person he is now. But how? Sakura asked, desperate. How does someone grow up in a village like Konoha and just give up on everyone who ever cared about him? Everything he worked hard to protect and build. You could ask the same about Sasuke Uchiha. Sakura bit her lip. That's different. Sasuke underwent major trauma at the hand of his brother. And you think Orochimaru had a picturesque life? His parents died in combat before he hit puberty. He was thrust into two of the most bloody wars in shinobi history and saw comrades and civilians slaughtered in front of him. He barely ever knew peacetime. At least half of his existence within Konoha was within times of war. But that's true for you as well. And Jiraiya. I was so stricken by a fear of blood that I left the village for decades and refused to return to active duty. Jiraiya was so haunted by the war-torn villages of Rain that he stayed behind and trained orphans, enemy orphans, to become shinobi, so that his conscience could be cleared. We all suffered under war. We all coped differently. Orochimaru. Maybe you should ask him why he's really so obsessed with the idea of immortality. Her amulet burned hot against her skin, and her chakra stilled, integrating itself with the natural energy around her. It's really not a question at all what the right thing to do is. He needs to die sooner or later. Nobody I love is safe as long as he's alive. She saw black markings begin to wind across her skin, the surest sign that she'd pulled nature energy into her body. She saw Gaara's disbelief out of the corner of her eye, and saw, with some amusement, the awestruck, yet still curious gaze that came onto Orochimaru's face. It's not about living forever, is it? It's about not dying. Every being was capable of love, and every being could be torn from that capability by will or circumstance. Another preaching of the Jushisai. An ideology that Sakura had seen in Gaara, a boy who'd had love wrested from him and thought himself incapable of it, thought it a pathetic emotion not worth the trouble it caused, and yet. Orochimaru saw his parents die young. Saw his comrades fall in war. Saw his teammates lose themselves to the grief of battle. All this misery and death was the cause. So tell me, after you've gotten all of that, then what? You know, Harano, I actually have no idea. It would be easy to let this man die. So easy. You listen up, you idiotic, sadistic bastard. Sakura placed one hand upon Orochimaru's forehead, and touched the other to her amulet. She felt energy well up within her, and knew, with just a push, that she could connect. I don't think you're worth saving. I don't think you're worth the effort or the chakra. I think I'd find joy in watching Sasori tear you to pieces, only overshadowed by the joy of letting me do it myself. You've hurt people precious to me, and many more than just that. You've killed because it served your purpose and haven't given a single thought about the people you were killing. People call you monster. I don't think that term's good enough. I think you're a worm that's lost sight of what it means to be human. You've retreated so far away from your own self that I wonder if there's anything left to what you used to be at all. No body. Not even an entire soul. You're pathetic. She pushed, feeling the flow of chakra within her sync with Orochimaru's, and then she felt pain. Blistering pain over every inch of her body, like sharp needle points had stabbed into every part of her skin. The poison, she realized, and it was somehow nothing compared to what she felt within her arms. They felt hollow, like a piece of her had been ripped out. Like an itch that could never be scratched, intensifying over time until she could barely think of anything else, could only think of what was missing and how she needed it back. This was what Orochimaru was feeling right now. The pain of the poison, yes, but the pain of the curse the third Hokage had wrought upon him, that he might never be able to heal. That she could heal, if she chose it. I'm not doing this because you're worth saving. She insisted, each word a struggle to produce as her body's synchronized pain threatened to throw her into unconsciousness. I'm doing this because I want what you wanted. A world where people don't have to needlessly die. A united world. No more war, no more suffering, no more death. And I need Oda to do it. Sakura pushed again, letting her chakra flow into the man. Poison control, that was the first part, the easiest. Separate the poison from the body and break it down, then heal the damage done to the veins, to the brain, to the organs. I could do it if you died here. I could do it with Karen's help. She's only too happy to sign my treaty. But I have to think bigger than that. I have to think of the ones I have yet to convert. The ones still doubting that I can do the impossible. That I can unite the shinobi countries. Sakura felt the pain of the poison begin to ebb from her body, and she knew that she had found success. The poison was clearing. Orochimaru would live, this body would live. And yet there was more. I'm doing this because if I can get Orochi fucking Maru's signature on that scroll, the entire world is going to see that there isn't anything I can't do. I'm doing this to show the world that I'm Sakura Haruno and that I will protect every person in this world that allies themselves with me, even pathetic bastards like you. So you pay attention, Orochimaru, because even if I come to regret this, even if you get everything you want at the cost of everyone I love. Sakura's vision began to flash white, and she was uncertain if it was from the pain or, somehow, from the connection. Still, she forced herself to speak, to say what she so desperately needed to say. You're never going to be able to live it down that it was all because of me. Sakura pushed harder than she'd ever pushed before, and all the white around her went black. Could you fix it? The damage to his soul. Tsunade shook her head. Not in the way he would like. That's impossible. The pieces of his soul that were severed by the Shinigami lie within its stomach now. You would have to face the Shinigami itself to get it back, and that would require a sacrifice of your own. But you still could help him. It would be a trade. Tsunade explained. Relocating the damage elsewhere. Like a skin graft of sorts, only what you take cannot grow back. I would have given him back his arms, but he would have lost something else in turn. It was an irony that I neglected to mention to him at the time. He's grown so used to being above consequence. To being so good at what he is that he can weather any retaliation. You wanted to punish him. I think I did. I wanted to punish him for killing our sensei. For daring to think he could use my pain against me for his gain. I was angry. Angry that he'd failed me. Failed. He was supposed to be the one that kept our heads on straight. That kept our minds on the goal and our hearts in line. That reminded us of what was at stake. He didn't just turn his back on Konoha, he turned his back on us. You miss him? Yes. Chakra was tied to the soul. Some said that chakra was recycled upon death, constantly being renewed and birthed upon new shinobi. It had to be tied to something beyond the body, or else Sasori couldn't have existed in his mechanical form, constantly generating new chakra despite the fact that he had left biology behind. And yet it wasn't the soul that generated chakra, for there were many born without any chakra at all, and clearly they must have souls nonetheless. The Jushisai had never spoken of healing souls because damaging a soul was rare and near impossible, and reversing said damage was, perhaps, the realm of the gods. Tsunade was referred to as a god of medicine by some, and if she truly was capable of doing what Sakura was about to attempt, she understood why. She didn't have a template on which to try this. All she could do was let go and leave the process in the hands of something greater. As she'd done before for Sai, before she'd known the mechanics of healing and how it worked, she put herself in Jashin's hands. She felt the patchwork of something overlaid on Orochimaru, within him, something that had been broken and would never again be whole. She felt something within her reach out to tear it apart once more, picking at the overlay piece by piece and placing it elsewhere. The itching, aching feeling left her arms and slowly, agonizingly, began to appear elsewhere. It was enough to almost make her let go, break the connection. In the blackness, Sakura saw color. A single speck of color, slowly spiraling down, as pink as her own hair. A petal? She dared not move, but the distraction, as brief as it was, provided her mind with sweet relief from the task she'd been focused on. Like a breath of fresh air after holding her head underwater, enough to let her delve back down again for a second go. She could finish this. She would finish what she started. Sakura plunged in once again, and let the agony overtake her. When she opened her eyes once again, the sand had fallen around them. Gaara was dueling with Sasori once again, frantically fighting off a legion of puppets alongside a few more summoned Tanuki. Next to her, Orochimaru took in a gasp of air, falling forward onto his hands and knees. Had she done it? No. What had she done? She could see the skin on Orochimaru's hands start to lighten, no longer that bruised, purple state she had seen on them before. The effect spread out until his hands resembled the natural paleness of his flesh. Orochimaru's head snapped towards her, no, looking behind her, and suddenly his hands flew through seals. Sakura ducked instinctively as fire spewed from Orochimaru's mouth, much hotter and fiercer than the fire he'd conjured earlier, and as she turned to see her assailant she realized that Sasori himself had charged her, only to be repelled by Orochimaru's ferocious attack. "My arms," she heard Orochimaru whisper, his voice full of glee. "You've given me back my arms." He moved to push himself to his feet, but as he did so, his legs suddenly buckled, unable to hold his weight. He crashed back to the ground, sprawled, and his eyes widened as he realized what had happened. Sakura glanced over, catching a glimpse of the skin on the man's feet, now purpling and bruising instead. "Looks like the girl has some healing talent." Sakura heard Sasori chuckle. The fire on his body had already begun to die down, leaving the puppet scorched but otherwise functional. "But if you can't even stand, what use will you be against me?" A coiled metal rope unwound from within Sasori's stomach, lashing out towards her just as Gaara's sand began to pull him away. However, before Sakura could move to defend herself, something rushed out from behind her, grabbing at the rope before it could touch her. Orochimaru's arms had extended out, winding around the rope like snakes and rushing for Sasori's body. Gaara's sand held the body in place as Orochimaru grasped at the cylindrical container within Sasori's chest. "You underestimated me, Sasori. I don't need legs to defeat you." Orochimaru pulled, and Sakura saw the puppet slacken as the cylinder was removed from its chest. They'd done this before, but this time Sakura knew they couldn't stop here. She reached for the pouch at her hip, pulling out an empty sealing scroll. One Sai had bequeathed her to carry things that would usually be too heavy. She unfurled it just as Orochimaru finished pulling the cylinder towards them. "On the scroll!" she cried out, and Orochimaru didn't need to be told twice. He thrust the cylinder onto the paper, and Sakura in turn channeled the last of her chakra into activating the seal. With a small puff of smoke, the cylinder that contained Sasori was gone, with only a confirmation seal left in its place on the scroll's surface. There was a moment of silence, and then Sakura felt all of the tension leave her body at once. "We did it." Her eyes flickered up to Orochimaru, who was still looking down at his hands, examining them. Moving each finger and no doubt reveling in the ability to push chakra through them without difficulty. His revel ceased quickly, however, as he attempted to move his legs once more, and found himself unable. "Sakura Harano," he said aloud. "I am genuinely not sure whether or not I should hate you right now." Sakura let out a gasping chuckle, reaching up to wipe sweat from her brow. In her mind she had a witty retort, some banter that could make light of the difficult situation they'd just put themselves through. She realized, seconds before she fell into Gaara's arms, that her body was out of chakra. Harassing Orochimaru would just have to wait until she woke up. Chapter 79. Sai really should have been able to predict by now that he'd never be able to predict what kind of situation Sakura would lead him into. It was a crapshoot whether it would be horrifying or amusing, though this time it was some odd joke of a blend between the two. He had sent out ingrats to track down his wayward teammates, finding them in a large room that was peppered with broken, inactivated puppets, as well as scorch marks from what was undoubtedly jutsu. Sakura was unconscious. Again, he'd really need to impress upon her that passing out wasn't really that good for her health, but he was immediately distracted by this thought upon seeing Orochimaru on the floor, not standing up despite the fact that he'd been perfectly capable of doing so the last time Sai had seen him. Gaara, somehow, looked just about as confused as he was. "Sasori's in the scroll," the Jinhuriki managed to state, nodding his head towards a scroll at his feet. "I don't think you're supposed to put people in those." A fair assessment, but Sasori worked hard to render himself to be less than human. Orochimaru added, reaching out for the scroll. His hand was slapped away by Gaara's sand, and the two looked at each other in a way that was absolutely comical, but Sai knew in his gut that if he laughed, the Sunin wouldn't suffer it. "That belongs to Suna now. He invaded my village, so my prisoner. You'd be dead if not for Sakura, so you owe us this. I would be fine if not for Harano, as Sasori wouldn't have traipsed in looking for her and you." Sai really didn't care who got Sasori at this point, though he supposed if Orochimaru had access to the man it might potentially work against them in the long run, but so long as Sasori was contained and no longer hunting them, that was one check off their list. Of course, if Sakura really cared about it, he could always sneak the Sasori scroll out later. "I'm really not sure what I'm supposed to be making of this." Sai heard Jugo speak behind him. The man sounded unnaturally level, almost like Sai had fresh out of root, though Karen had informed him that it was emotional discipline necessary to keep Jugo's apparently murderous thoughts at bay, rather than any effort to create a perfect soldier. If it helps, I don't either. Sai put on his best smile for the boy. But Orochimaru with paralyzed legs is probably some rather damning information. He let his voice grow over Orochimaru and Gaara's bickering. If I told Lady Tsunade about this, she might spit her drink over it. And what makes you think I care what Tsunade thinks? I don't, but she's Hokage, and she's certainly going to tell every allied leader all about it, if only to spite you. Orochimaru didn't speak again, but his hand slunk away from the scroll, allowing Gaara to grab it with his sand and float it over to Sai. And with that, Sai was holding a member of Akatsuki in his back pocket. He'd never be able to predict what sort of situation Sakura would throw him in. But he was starting to find a strange sort of thrill to it. He left the four to their business. He knew Sakura was safe in Gaara's hands and Jugo would figure out whatever the hell was going on with Orochimaru, and since he'd found the rather mutilated corpse of Kabuto just down the hallway, he knew he didn't have to worry about him either. The only final loose end to tie up was the one he'd left with Sasuke and Karen. There was a light-heartedness to his step that he'd learned only came with the knowledge that a hard battle was done. He didn't think it would ever top the feeling of seeing Danzo dead and knowing he was free, but dealing with a hard enemy that wanted his friends dead came fairly close. And where the hell is Sakura? You said you were getting her. Karen's voice jolted him out of his post-battle reverie as he approached Deidara's containment. Sasuke and Deidara were bickering, expected, and Karen looked as though she was ready to strangle both of them. She's unconscious. Sai said simply. But not dead, right? No, not dead. Sai pulled Sasori's scroll out of his pocket and held it up with a smile. Sasori's in here. You aren't supposed to put people in those. That's what I said. Karen let out an audible groan, and Sai felt a rare, natural laugh come to him. At least someone else found the situation as ridiculous as he did. Has Deidara spoken about Itachi? Yeah, but not anything useful. It seems like he'd just as soon join Sasuke on the Itachi murder party, surprisingly enough. It's hard to believe they're in the same group. Perhaps it was a strange form of loyalty, despite a dislike of a partner. Sai made his way over to the barrier, deciding Sasuke had gotten his chance. He'd been trained in interrogation en route, and now he had an excuse to put it to work for something that actually mattered to him. Finally came crawling back, Deidara, to Sasuke's annoyance, made a heel turn out of the conversation to address Sai. Can you please let me out for a minute? I won't even use bombs, I just want to kick this brat's ass. Maybe in a minute, if he doesn't behave. Sai smiled as Sasuke threw an angry grunt his way. He's lying about Itachi. Of course he is. He's Akatsuki. Sasuke's eyes met his own briefly, and Sai held firm. He could tell the Uchiha still wanted a chance to interrogate, but to his surprise, Sasuke backed down. Sai wasn't sure if it was out of some newfound respect or the fact that Karen was glaring him down behind them, but he was grateful that Sasuke could at least show slightly more maturity than he'd thought him capable of. And he could use the window to do some good, anyway. Tell me what you know about Itachi and where he is, and I'll let you fist fight Sasuke. He ignored the sound of Sasuke sputtering behind him and instead focused on Deidara, who had snorted somewhat endearingly before leaning against the barrier to talk. I told him, I don't know fuck all about where Itachi is. He's been missing for like a month or so now. Sai ignored the sound of Sasuke hissing. He didn't say that, behind him. Missing? Yeah, him and Kisame both. Sent leader into a rage. Sasori was supposed to interrogate Harino about it, but I can see you all don't know either. Personally, the bastard can fuck right off for all I care. Akatsuki doesn't seem like it's holding together very well, does it? Hey, quit talking like you've converted me. Deidara protested. Sasori's out, Itachi and Kisame fucked off, we've still got half a dozen shinobi that are far more capable than I am at kicking your ass. If you keep pissing off leader. He probably should have just come himself, if he's so strong. Sai countered. Seems cowardly to send others to do his dirty work. Yeah, okay, I can't argue with that. Deidara shrugged. I can only tell you that he's stronger than me. Plus there's the zombie duo. Haiden and Kakuzu? Oh, we can deal with them. Deidara grinned. I really can't tell if that confidence is cute or stupid. It's a simple manner of understanding motivations. Sai smiled in turn. So that brings us back to you, doesn't it? What can we do to convince you to make your art for our side? Deidara was quiet, but he gestured with his hand for Sai to come closer. Sai hesitated, but the barrier seemed solid enough, so he walked until he was just next to the barrier. Deidara leaned close, as though he was about to whisper a secret. Eat shit. Then, Deidara pulled a large lump of clay out of his pouch, shoving it into his mouth without much ceremony. Sai would have commented if not for the fact that Deidara's body immediately began to contort and grow, disturbing even before the realization that Deidara was making himself explode. He cursed, loudly, only to find Sasuke of all people pulling him away from the barrier. He heard the large sound of explosion and felt the ground shake beneath his feet, and as he looked towards the spot where Deidara once was, he saw parts. He really was crazy enough to blow himself up. Ugh, do you guys not trust me at all? I told you he couldn't get through my barrier. Karen called out to them from nearby. What a waste though. If he couldn't have directed us to attack, he could have at least given us a little more on Akatsuki. Sorry, Sasuke. Sasuke grunted, letting go of the back of Sai's shirt. Sai gave him a respectful nod, even though the barrier had held. If it hadn't, he'd have owed Sasuke his life. Sakura was going to kill him, though, for letting Deidara explode. He forced himself to look back at the mess as Karen lowered the barrier. Was there anything left to salvage? Any scrolls, any weapons? Probably not. Though for some reason the parts looked strange, as though they were changed color a bit quicker than parts were supposed to. Not parts. Clay. The son of a bitch had blown up a clone, and now the barrier was down. He saw the earth open up just in time to catch the real Deidara hopping out of it, having used the hiding in earth technique to remain out of sight just until the barrier had come down. With a puff of smoke, a bird appeared, and Deidara was out of the range of the barrier before Karen could throw it up again. It's been fun, but I'm not sticking around without Sasori to back me up. Deidara gave a cheeky wave. You'd better practice your art, cause the next time we meet, I'm gonna blow you away. Sai half expected Sasuke to charge in again, but as he looked towards the Uchiha, the boy merely huffed. I'm tired. Sasuke admitted. And he's not worth it. I'm going to find Sakura. A sentiment Sai could at least half agree upon, though as he watched Deidara disappear into the horizon, he grappled with a strange and unusual sense of anticipation. Sakura woke to the familiar feeling of chakra exhaustion and a pressure between her eyes. She groaned, lying still for a moment until the pressure passed and she could allow herself to process reality. Sasori was captured, and seeing that she was still alive, Deidara had likely been disabled as well. 2 down. 6 to go. She was back in the bedroom Orochimaru had lent to them, and wasn't surprised to see Gaara there, as he usually was whenever chakra exhaustion got the better of her. Sai? She asked, her voice hoarse. Alive and well? Gaara answered. But Deidara got away. Really? Karen seemed so sure he couldn't bomb out of her barrier. Apparently he's craftier than we thought. Ugh. Sakura groaned again as she pushed herself into a sitting position. So we really only just took care of Sasori. Better than nothing, but with how much Haiden had touted that Deidara might be able to be swayed to their side. Hey, you're up. The door to the room swung open and Karen walked in, grinning from ear to ear as she made her way to Sakura's side. Have I told you that I love you? She continued, sitting down next to her. I love you. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. Thanks. Also, for goodness sake, how much chakra did you use in that fight? The girl rolled up her sleeve, and as Sakura looked at her arm she saw small welts decorating the skin. Welts in crescent shapes, looking strangely like. Yes, bite it, I know it's weird, but I can give you a chakra transfusion. Karen explained. I can keep waxing on about how great you are once you're back to normal. Sakura shot a wary look to Gaara, who merely shrugged. It wasn't as though she was really keen on the idea of biting Karen, but the girl was insisting, so Sakura swallowed her trepidation and leaned forward. Well, She couldn't say it didn't work, but she was going to make sure she never had to do it again. Kabuto's dead, just like I wanted, and now Orochimaru's chair-bound, which normally wouldn't have mattered at all if he had Kabuto to wheel him around, but he doesn't, which means he's looking for someone new. Karen began to explain. Plus, Kabuto kept the pain of the soul curse at bay. Nobody else knew how to do it, and I doubt he trusts anyone else to learn. He's going to have to either rely on me or risk picking someone else, and I can guarantee that he picks one of mine. You've practically gift-wrapped me Oto on a platter. He can use his jutsu more easily, though. Oh please, like he'll be able to beat me and Sasuke. Karen rolled her eyes. And maybe he's stronger now, but without his little minion to go around keeping order, he's going to start losing people to me. Karen was confident, Sakura had to give her that. She still wasn't sure things were going to be that easy, but it was nice to feel that inkling of hope inside her chest, especially after what it had taken to get them there. Orochimaru has his arms back. It was entirely possible the world was going to denounce her just for that. Every cage currently on the treaty agreed that Orochimaru was a threat, and now she'd gone and, well, armed him. Would this potentially mean Sasuke's end? Would this mean her own, now that she'd gone and offered him information on Kaguya in order to survive the fight with Sasori? Sakura didn't have answers. All she could cling to was that they were alive and that Akatsuki was down a man, which made them ever so much smaller of a threat. The infusion of chakra from Karen was more than enough to get her back on her feet, though Sakura took things easy at first, nursing some wounds and checking on her spear, which had weathered the attack but would need repair in the long run. She allowed herself to take a breath and unwind as Karen prattled on about the future, moving to check her reflection in the mirror. She looked exhausted, undeniably, and her hair had started to get long again. It was strange, after so many years of wearing it long, she'd gotten used to wearing it short. The only reason it had gotten so long again was that, ironically, she'd stopped caring so much about her appearance. It was strangely easy to forget why she'd grown it so long in the first place. Why she'd even begun this journey. Why she, personally, had wanted to come to Oto at all. There was still one last weight on her shoulders she needed to remove. Karen, I need to speak with Sasuke. What? Him. Karen blinked in surprise, midway into talking about communication reforms in Oto. Oh, he's off sparring with Sai, I think. She grinned, somewhat mischievously. Ever since Sai nailed him with that dart, Sasuke's had it in for him. Sakura laughed. Of course he did. Ever the one-track mind, Sasuke, exactly as Naruto was, too. Once they found somebody worth challenging, they wouldn't stop until that somebody had been defeated. Take me to them, please, she asked. And we can talk about Oto later. There's been something I've been putting off, and now that Akatsuki's been pushed back, there's no better time for it. Karen seemed a little disappointed at being ignored in favor of Sasuke, but Sakura was learning by now that the girl didn't upset that easily, and simply preferred to tease or provoke whenever the situation suited her. It was a trait she could see passing on to Naruto. It continued to surprise her how similar the two cousins were at times, despite the completely different upbringing. Perhaps there was something akin to an Uzumaki temperament. True to her word, Sakura was taken to one of the training rooms, and there she saw Sai and Sasuke going blade to blade, though this time it appeared as though they had agreed to light ninjutsu. Sai used ink birds to force Sasuke to fight at range, only drawing his blade if Sasuke got close enough to be a threat. Sasuke, in turn, was attempting to use what looked to be an extension of the Chidori to run visible current through his own blade. It was likely more effective against living opponents, but fared well at dispersing Sai's birds before they could get close enough to hit. It was less the charged competition that they had engaged in before, and more a true spar, now that Sakura thought about it. The two boys had succeeded in repelling Akatsuki and had decided to celebrate by training. Two peas in a pod. Karen seemed to read her mind as she watched the two spar. They sort of look a bit similar too, don't you think? What? Sakura frowned. I don't see it. Dark hair, fair skin, bit of an ego. Alright, maybe there was something to it, but Sakura wasn't going to tell either of the boys that. It was Sasuke who noticed her first, ducking to avoid a stray bird so that he could address her with a small nod. With that, the spar came to a quiet halt, mutual understanding between the two that their time, for the moment, was ended. Sakura. Sai gave her a smile as he sheathed his blade. I hope you are well enough to spar. I don't think this one is going to stand any more delays. Sakura could have sworn she saw a vein pop in Sasuke's head as he shot the other boy a glare, but she couldn't help but laugh at the comment. I think you guys got the better deal in the fight, by the sound of things, other than Deidara giving you all the slip. He knew nothing about Itachi. Sasuke answered. There was no use in going after him. Other than the whole regrouping back at Akatsuki to share information on our techniques and come back to fight us again point. Sai countered, still smiling sweetly even as Sasuke glared daggers into his back. I think he's scared of whomever leads Akatsuki, Sakura. If we can convince him that he's safe with us, he'd leave. We'll have to keep working him then. Sakura agreed. But for now, I need to speak with Sasuke alone, if you don't mind. The look on Sai's face told her that he understood why. Even Gaara, so used to being at her side, took his leave. Not that they didn't already know what was about to be discussed, no, that wasn't the reason for the privacy. Sakura just didn't know how Sasuke would react to the news. It wouldn't be good, either way, and he deserved his privacy for that. So, anywhere that's actually private around here? Sakura asked, waiting for the room to empty before turning to the Uchiha. You're not here to ask me out again, are you? There was a knowing smirk in Sasuke's eyes, a teasing look that reminded Sakura of how he used to speak with Naruto, sometimes, and something in her melted in being able to see Sasuke so relaxed. Something he'd never really been in Konoha, other than the odd moment where Naruto was able to drag it out of him. She let the comment roll off her back, shaking her head gently. No, Sasuke, it really is important. I promise. It's half the reason I'm here in Oto at all, actually, and I would have told you sooner if I hadn't been worried about Akatsuki banging down our door. Sasuke's smirk faded as he read her tone, and after a moment he gave her a simple nod before gesturing for her to follow. He led her through several winding passageways before coming to a simple door, marked only with a paper seal where the handle should have been. He placed a hand over the seal and the seal glowed, a chakra lock, Sakura realized, no doubt designed by Karen. Inside was a relatively simple-looking bedroom. Sakura did note some hooks on the wall to hang weapons, as well as a shelf filled to the brim with books, textbooks on jutsu and chakra theory. It was surprising at first, but Orochimaru was a scholar, so of course he would have required reading for his star pupil. It was quaint, though almost military, and for a moment Sakura was ready to write the room off as boring, until she caught sight of a strange device in the back corner of the room. What is that? Sasuke looked over to it before shrugging. Something Karen gave me. It plays music. Music, really? Like records or discs? Yeah. Sasuke pulled over a chair from a nearby desk for her before sitting down on his bed. She keeps wanting me to listen to all of these musicians. Waste of time. There was a slight flush to his cheeks, however, that told Sakura what he really thought of the music, even if he wouldn't admit it aloud. She wanted to continue to make small talk. It would have been easier to keep talking about music, or training, or even just living in Oto. Sakura sighed. It just wasn't shaping up to be an easy week. Sasuke, well, I have a lot of talk about, actually, and it involves your brother and your family, as well as a particular sect that used to exist in Konoha. What I need to know first is if you know anything about the faction called Root. She could tell she'd gotten Sasuke's rapt attention with just the mention of his brother, though he shook his head at her question. Never heard of it. All right, that checks out. Sakura replied. Now, and I know this question is about to seem even stranger, did you know about your family's plans to stage a coup for control of Konoha? She saw Sasuke's hand grip the bed tighter, and his eyes narrowed as they met her own. She saw his Sharingan spin, and she refused to let herself look away. He was trying to figure out if she was lying, playing him for a fool. I didn't come here without evidence to back up anything I'm saying, Sasuke, but I need to know how much you know and how much I need to tell you. This is the first time I'm hearing of any of this. Sasuke answered. And I don't see what any of this has to do with Itachi. You will. Sakura said solemnly. I'll tell you everything I know. It took longer than she thought, beginning from when she first learned about Root from Sai, going through her battle with Itachi, her revelations with Shikamaru, the strange Sharingan-wielding ghost in the Uchiha Shrine, and thankfully, Sasuke didn't seem too shaken up about the breaking and entering. She ended with the trial and brief civil war, going into as much detail as she could recall about the strange Sharingan techniques that Danzo wielded and the horrific realization as to why Danzo had wanted the Uchiha dead to begin with. She pulled out a scroll and handed it to Sasuke, the scroll in which had been sealed Danzo's arm as well as all of the compiled evidence that she and Shikamaru had put together for the trial. The documents of the Uchiha coup, witness testimonies on the activities of Root, her own testimony on Itachi, she'd left nothing out, in the hope that Sasuke could at least find some closure in that justice had been done on Danzo for his actions, though she knew it was likely a fleeting hope. His entire clan dead, all to fuel one man's ambitions and drive for a power that could usually only be achieved through genetic luck, how could anyone find any sort of peace and closure knowing that? Sasuke was quiet, so quiet she thought he might have even stopped breathing. His knuckles had turned white from gripping at the bed, and his eyes had never left her own, even when she sometimes found it impossible to meet them. He only moved when she leaned forward to offer him the scroll, and it was only when he unsealed the contents within that he stopped his intense gaze. He ignored the documents and instead lingered on the arm, perfectly preserved due to whatever strange research had given them the power to wield the couple dozen Sharingan running up and down its length. She saw Sasuke bite at his lip as he reached out, his hand getting almost close enough to touch one of the eyes before sharply pulling away. He stood, then, walking to the other side of the room with clenched fists and a stiff back. Sakura let the quiet fill the air for a while, to allow Sasuke time to process. It was a lot, it was still a lot even after she'd experienced the process of putting it all together. It was personal now, but that had been by choice. She'd chosen to delve in, to expose Danzo and free Konoha of his influence. It was personal for Sasuke too, but in the horrible way of not getting to choose, of having this knowledge and fate thrust upon him. That's everything I know at the moment. Sakura finally spoke. I have a letter from Lady Tsunade for you. I don't know exactly what she wrote, but I'm sure her condolences aren't exactly what you want to hear. Still, she sent them anyway, and I dash. You're right. Sasuke finally spoke. I don't want to hear it. His words were like ice, and Sakura flinched when his voice reached her. She could feel the stillness in the air being stirred by what had to be his chakra, an angry aura swirling about and resonating against her own. You killed him? He asked, turning to meet her with Sharingan still blazing red. I helped. Sakura admitted. Sai took the arm off. Naruto landed the finishing blow. Naruto, Sasuke nodded. Naruto, he knows all of this. He was on the investigation with us, yes. He's the one who found the Third's original decree for Root to disband. There was a strange sort of relief in Sasuke's eyes in the admission, and Sakura wasn't quite sure why. Perhaps he was grateful that Naruto had fought for his sake, had enacted justice for his sake, but she was no mind reader, and Sasuke had never been one to easily share his thoughts. If you hadn't killed him, I would have. He said with finality. No one in Konoha would have stopped me. I don't think most people in Konoha would have. He tried to have you killed, too. You, and Gaara, and Sai. Of course he did. We were learning the truth. Sakura answered with a shrug. I mean, if I was in his position, what else could I have done? I don't really hold that against him so much as everything else. You shouldn't let it go. Sasuke lectured. None of it. Not a single bit of it. It's not just Danzo, Sakura, it's everything, everyone around him that failed to act until now. Everyone that was complicit or served a role in keeping him in power. Everyone who ran when he told them to run and didn't think he was worth challenging. Everyone in that stupid village dash. Sasuke suddenly lashed out, slamming his fist against the wall with enough strength to even shake the floor beneath them. Sakura's hand flew to her kunai on instinct, even with the knowledge in the back of her mind that Sasuke didn't have any real reason to want to hurt her. Everyone, Sasuke continued. Except our classmates. The ones who acted. The ones who put him down. Everyone else in that village can rot. Though in her mind Sakura could hear herself speaking up in defense of the village, she just couldn't bring herself to actually do it. His pain, she realized, was not something to downplay. To deny his pain, to deny the complacency of the village and the part the system had played in allowing Danzo to keep in power, denial would only make such pain grow. Denial would only lead to more suffering. No, in order for Sasuke's pain to ebb, he had to confront it in whichever way suited him best. This was Sasuke's pain, not her own, and pain was considered a holy concept under Jashinism. A tool to motivate, a tool for change, a tool to understand others and, with understanding, even a tool to heal. Maybe, she found herself finally speaking. Maybe it was for the best that you left Konoha. She looked to Sasuke again and found shock on his face, no doubt not expecting the answer she'd given. But what shocked her in turn was the sudden wave of grief that seemed to overcome him, an emotion she'd never seen on him before. His Sharingan faded and his onyx eyes filled with tears, and when he spoke again it was no longer ice but a crackle of emotion that Sakura couldn't put words to. Why did Itaka listen to him? Sakura moved, her feet pushing her forward before her mind could even think to tell herself to hold back. Before she could stop, she was wrapping her arms around Sasuke in a tight hug. It was familiar, doing this, the same sort of desperate move she'd done when he'd been overcome by the anger and power of Orochimaru's curse in the Forest of Death. Only this time, there was no anger, only rasping sobs as Sasuke clung to her in turn. She stayed with him until his tears ran out. Chapter 80. The room was warm, specifically warm. Sakura wouldn't have been surprised if the room was set to an exact temperature for some reason or another to do with biology, not that she felt like asking Orochimaru about the specifications of his various labs, but the part of her mind that was always seeking knowledge was lingering on so many questions as she stepped further in. There were machines with dozens of tubes running in and out of them, gas cylinders lined carefully along the back wall, microscopes, notebooks, what looked like freezers, and seals lining the room in such tiny, intricate formations that she had thought it patterned wallpaper until her eyes had caught a closer glimpse. Cell culture requires an overbearing hand. Orochimaru told her as he wheeled himself into the room behind her. It's easy to culture life, but so very difficult to culture only one type of life. Every factor needs to be accounted for. So naturally you brought me in here to discuss politics. No, my dearest Sakura, I brought you in here to discuss a god. More dramatics. Sakura was getting used to Orochimaru having to set up a scene before getting to the heart of things. She was beginning to get the impression that he liked to be noticed, liked standing out. The man seemed nonplussed by the loss of his legs, far more eager to make use of his newly restored hands. With a strange chakrik technique, he would elongate his arms like winding snakes to grab whatever it was he needed without having to maneuver to the other side of the room. Still, the wheelchair occasionally bumped against the legs of tables and walls, and Sakura was torn. Would it be rude to offer help? Would Orochimaru take it as her thinking him weak or incapable? You and I both know that Kaguya is not a god, of course. Orochimaru continued to talk, bringing Sakura away from her thoughts. Kaguya was a woman who came into great power, and her lineage can be traced in the lines of every shinobi on the continent. Chakra is her legacy. Prior to that, humans were quite chakra deficient. There are ancient records of sages learning how to harness natural chakra, but they were oddities. So too was Kaguya as an oddity, but she was the true first to take chakra within herself and make it a part of who she was. The God Tree. Sakura finished for him, remembering her visions in her lectures at Takigakure. She ate a fruit and somehow that pooled chakra within her. That is indeed how the legend goes. But if such a tree existed, would we not have knowledge of it still? Are you saying you don't believe the legend? Do you? She'd seen the tree, of course, in visions that Jashin had given to her in her time at the Enclave. She'd tasted the sweet flesh of the fruit as though it had been her. I believe. Sakura answered firmly. But I do also find it strange that there is no record of the tree. Surely if she had gained such power, others too would have tried to. Unless it was hidden. Orochimaru countered with a knowing smile. Kaguya was said to be a fearful goddess. One who turned against the world to protect her children, who then turned against her once they learned the truth. I believe fully that the tree exists, and that unless we come to match Kaguya's power, we may never discover it. And we are none of us yet capable of such a thing. Yet, I have ambitions, Sakura Haruno. This should not surprise you. Orochimaru proceeded to open a door to one of the machines, pulling out what looked like a petri dish. He swiveled about and wheeled towards a microscope, putting the plate under it before beckoning Sakura over. Look here, Sakura. See the fruits of my success. Cells grown from remnants of the goddess. Sakura couldn't believe what she was hearing at first. And certainly she wasn't familiar enough with cells to determine the difference between these and a normal humans, but she looked into the scope nonetheless. Sure enough, there were cells. She could remember at least that much from what she had read in her youth and had been taught by the Jushisai. Now, watch them closely. Orochimaru spoke, so close to her head that Sakura couldn't help but shiver. She wasn't afraid, no, if Orochimaru wanted her dead it would have been attempted by now, but sometimes he was just so creepy. But watch she did as Orochimaru added something to the petri dish. Something red. Had he just added blood to the dish? Blood is a potent carrier of chakra. Orochimaru began to explain. So it will suffice for the demonstration. I had hoped, you see, to infuse Kagaya's cells within a living body and use it to strengthen one's abilities. You may have heard of similar experiments of mine commissioned by Root. She hadn't, but Sakura didn't admit it aloud. She could ask Tsunade to investigate later. Instead she watched as the cells in the dish suddenly moved, so quickly that she could scarcely believe cells capable of such speed. The cells seemed to grow and envelop the red blood cells that had been introduced, until nothing left of the addition remained. In their place, the Kagaya cells had multiplied, covering the surface of the dish more thoroughly than before. You saw the unfortunate volunteer I was working on the day you arrived. Orochimaru continued. Kagaya cells are extremely violent. When introduced to the body, they devour the native cells and attempt to replace them with copies of themselves. Like they were trying to become the body. Sakura finished, still not really quite believing what she was seeing. And where had Orochimaru even gotten this cell line, anyway? Would he tell her, if she asked? She put her hands together, summoning her chakra in order to send out a sensing pulse. Orochimaru's chakra was there, of course, overwhelming, but there were other sources too. The cells in front of her and what seemed like at least a dozen pricks echoed from the room, more cultures, no doubt. Do it again. She told him, a theory coming to mind. Orochimaru chuckled but obliged her, and Sakura continued to pulse as the cells once again moved to envelop the blood that was offered. The chakra within the blood, Orochimaru's chakra, she realized, he was feeding the cells with his own blood, was faint, but she could still pick it up, at least, until the Kagaya cells devoured the blood. It was rapid, but Sakura could pick up on it. It wasn't just absorbing the blood, it was altering the chakra. She had no other term for it but neutralization, removing the aspects that her sensing jutsu recognized as elemental affinity until only pure chakra remained, and then, well, the cells multiplied, no doubt fueled by the pure chakra. From what she knew of medical jutsu, it required a certain type of chakra, one that was unaffected by affinity, lest the recipient of the jutsu reject the chakra's work. These cells. They're using medical jutsu to replicate. She deduced in awe. They're converting the chakra in the blood to something they can use to rapidly make new growth, and using the physical cell components as material. Automatic replication. Precisely. Orochimaru purred. Does it not make you wonder what the full life form was capable of? Automatic replication means automatic healing. And if her cells could neutralize chakra, she could neutralize jutsu. Sakura replied. Much like Gaara's golden sand, was the technique tied to Kagaya, somehow? Well, she supposed every technique was, in some way. But it's possible she could neutralize it without even having to think about it. And that's just one thing she might have been capable of. But something about that doesn't make sense. Sakura noted. Why would her cells try to overtake a host body? Is that just a side effect of their natural drive to consume foreign chakra? Perhaps. But my current theory is, Orochimaru suddenly stopped, and Sakura pulled away from the microscope to look at him. Well, perhaps I shouldn't give it all away just yet. So you brought me in here to tease me? I brought you in here to repay you for the gift you've given me. You may call me many things, Sakura, but I am fair. You give something to me, and I shall give something in turn. Orochimaru's arm extended, reaching towards a nearby shelf. He pulled a small, rolled-up scroll from the shelf and brought it within Sakura's reach. My gift to you, he announced. You saved my life by healing Sasori's poison. And while I cannot travel you to repay some life debt, I can offer you a means to save your life, should the situation call for it. Sakura wasn't quite sure what this had to do with Kagaya's cells until she opened the scroll and unsealed the contents within. It was a small capsule with a covered syringe, kept chilled by whatever seals Orochimaru had used to contain it. As it stands, injecting Kagaya's cells into a host will cause the cells to destroy the host's chakra. The cell growth will likely kill the host, unless they are particularly resilient, but even if the host lives they will be unable to use chakra ever again, not even with Kagaya's cells inside them. For all my desire, the host cannot command Kagaya's line. A lethal injection, if not a straight-up game-changer. Even if someone was resistant to poison, otherwise immune to jutsu, they couldn't fight off the legacy of a goddess. Sakura sealed the vial back into the scroll. Thank you. She finally managed, clipping the scroll into her pouch alongside her others. Though I hope I'll never have to use it. Of course not. Ever the pacifist. But you and I both know who hunts you. I could not defeat Itachi Uchiha, and he is not the leader of Akatsuki, the one who commands them. Sakura got the implications. Strong enemies might require strong solutions. But, of course, Orochimaru didn't know about what Hyden had been getting up to behind the scenes. She resisted the urge to smile to herself. That would be her little secret, for now. And speaking of pacifism, Orochimaru. Have you decided, then, to tell me your methods of defeating the Sharingan? Sakura swallowed. She'd thought about it long and hard, especially now that Orochimaru had the use of his arms again. There was really only one answer. One answer that worked best for the world, and for the people she cared for. I cannot share those methods, Orochimaru, not even for your cooperation. If you would sign on to the treaty, you would sign on because you want to, not because of some secret I have to offer you. She'd hoped it was a good enough diversion from the real reason she didn't want to share her techniques. And Orochimaru didn't even seem shocked, in fact, he looked as though he'd been expecting it. You are truly attempting the impossible, Sakura, but I cannot help but admire it. I, too, seek the impossible. Immortality. Knowledge of every jutsu. Power to surpass Kagaya. We may not be aligned, but we could be friends, you and I. You returned to me my arms, after all. And no gift for that? Sakura wondered, but then she remembered the initial terms by which she had gotten Orochimaru to fight on her side anyway. She'd promised to tell him everything, and he had not come to make her keep good on her promise. The arms, she figured, were a better trade. Friends. She repeated. But no interest in the treaty. Don't you think that conflicts, a bit? I always did better running things on my own. I have no desire to have others dictate how I run my village. But that does not mean we need be hostile to each other. It wasn't what she wanted. It wasn't Orochimaru's signature on a page. And the last thing Sakura wanted was this snake for a friend, but... You're right. She agreed. We don't need to be hostile. And maybe in time I can convince you that an alliance won't harm your way of life. Perhaps in time. Orochimaru answered. But Sakura could see in his eyes that he didn't mean it. She wasn't surprised, of course, but after everything they'd done, after all she'd said. Who was she kidding? Sai would have flicked her right in the forehead for even entertaining the idea that Orochimaru could ever change. But as she returned to her quarters, fingering the scroll that he'd given her, she still couldn't help but imagine a world where he could. The night was quiet, with only the sound of an ever-present wind running through the alleyways. Gaara kept his eyes to the sky, half certain that the other Akatsuki, Deidara, would return at any moment to finish what he and his partner had started. Foolish. Shukaku insisted. He'll report to the head and they'll make a new plan of action. But, well, Gaara had become a warrior in the past year, and taking the night shift wasn't exactly something new to him. He didn't trust Orochimaru's ilk not to try and pull something on their last night in Oto, but he did trust Sai and, well, he supposed Karen was decent enough. She reminded him of Naruto in more than just namesake, boisterous, friendly, a strange way with words that just got right to the heart of things. No, Sakura was fine, but nobody else in the village knew to look out for a rogue bomber, and so he watched the night sky for them. Even alert as he was, he still barely caught the sound of approaching footsteps. Sasuke Uchiha had gotten good at moving silently, but Gaara was more concerned with why he'd come out onto the rooftops at all. He didn't move as Sasuke came to a halt next to him, and said nothing as the boy sat down, gazing up at the sky as he did. They sat in silence for a long time, to the point where even Shukaku began to throw out snide comments about learning the meaning of small talk. Gaara didn't mind. He didn't like Sasuke, he wasn't sure he ever had, but at least the boy appreciated silence. It was a shame, of course, when it finally ended. You were the one who told me that my eyes were filled with hate. Sasuke eventually spoke. Just like you. Gaara simply nodded. At the time, it was true. And now we're here. He finished, looking to him. Their eyes met, and Gaara saw where Sasuke was going. That hatred, Gaara didn't see it anymore. Not in Sasuke's eyes. And not in his own, whenever he saw his reflection. Had they grown? Had they moved past that which drove the anger in their hearts? Gaara still felt that hollow ache when he thought of Suna, when he thought of his uncle and the village's scorning glares. He was certain Sasuke still felt that pain as well, how could he not? How could one ever move past the massacre of their family, especially now that he knew it was someone within Konoha who had orchestrated it for personal and political gain? And yet, it was Sakura, wasn't it? Sasuke asked. I never thought she could come so far. She was always he bit his lip, and Gaara could fill in the blanks. Weak. Useless. Incompetent. All things Sakura had believed of herself before Oniki had taken her in. And perhaps still sometimes believed. Just because you think you know someone doesn't mean you truly understand them. A lesson Gaara had learned well, even just in reaching out to Shukaku. A demon, Suna had called him. His friend, he now thought with fondness. Disgusting. Shukaku answered with a fake retch. You're right. Sasuke agreed. I thought I knew Sakura. Thought I knew, Itake. So he's having an existential crisis. Gaara hushed Shukaku before looking to Sasuke again. He still committed the act. The reason matters little. So you would condemn him for following orders? Yes. It was almost baffling how easy the answer came to Gaara, but he had left his village to join Sakura. To unite the shinobi world. To bring peace. Breaking the rules was something he'd gotten accustomed to. The answer seemed to satisfy Sasuke momentarily. He nodded, looking up towards the sky again. I don't know. Sasuke admitted. I don't know what to think anymore. But I know what I have to do. I have to hear the truth from him. Gaara nodded. It was logical, as Sai would put it. Hear the testimony of the accused, and decide the course of action from there. I've always been prepared to kill him. I still am. I'll do it, if I have to. If I should. Maybe I still want to. Maybe all that hatred hasn't really left. I thought you were stronger for it. Stronger than me. Stronger than anyone. Had he been? Had he really been so strong, half blind with rage, barely conscious with Shukaku's power flowing haphazardly through him? He'd been strong when he'd been protecting Sakura. Strong when he had worked in tandem with Shukaku. Strong when he was with his friends. Naruto should have taught you different. Sasuke smirked, and Gaara heard a soft chuckle leave his lips. He tried. Sasuke admitted. But I wasn't capable of hearing it. Not in that village, in that place. Not where nobody else could understand me. But Karen dash. And then Gaara saw a faint flush, and he wasn't sure if it was the mention of Karen or that Sasuke had overshared, though he was more convinced it was the latter. Sasuke had never been particularly verbose, as far as Sakura had told him. He got the implications, though, without Sasuke having to say a word. Karen was his Sakura. Karen had reached him where nobody else had. You chose not to be ruled by hatred anymore. Sasuke spoke again. You chose to follow Sakura. Yes. When I first heard, I thought you were foolish. But I think I understand now. And then Sasuke stood, shooting one last glance towards the Jinchuriki before walking away. That's all. He finished as he left. I just thought you'd like to know. The silence and wind eventually filled the air again, but as Gaara looked up to the sky, Shukaku's voice entered his mind once more. He's still a prick. Gaara snorted, and in the stillness of the night, he let himself laugh for a good, long time. Check the description for the links to the author.